Welcome back to Loud About Loss. Today, I have an incredible guest joining me, someone who is shaking up the way we think about grief and giving lost parents the tools to rebuild their lives with intention. Angela Krupp is a licensed speech pathologist turned grief mentor who is challenging outdated ideas about what it means to grieve. In her career, she has helped individuals regain function and independence after life altering losses, and that same skill set now fuels her work in the infant and pregnancy loss space. After losing her daughter Avianna to SIDS, Angela refused to accept the idea that grief is just something you endure. Instead, she dove into the neuroscience behind it, studying neural mapping, manifestation, and how we can actually practice grief in a way that helps us move forward without leaving our child behind. Through her mentorship programs, grief retreats, and her online boutique, Fly AV Fly,
Mhm.
which funds scholarships for bereaved parents, Angela is on a mission to help lost parents reclaim their lives, set boundaries, and break free from the expectations that keep so many of us stuck. Her approach isn't about fixing grief, hallelujah. It's about making it functional. And I cannot wait for you to hear her perspective. So let's dive in. Angela, welcome to Loud About Loss. I'm so happy
Thank you
you're
so
here.
much. I'm so glad you're having me, Becky. I very much appreciate it.
So, I want to hear Aviana's story. Will you share it with us?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure. So my wonderful sweet daughter, Aviana, was born in 2015. I cannot believe it's been that long.
Oh my gosh.
I know, it's crazy. It kind of like makes my heart beat really fast when I think about that. So she was born August 18th in
Should be
2010.
10 this year. 10, right? Oh my
She will be
gosh.
10. Yes. And so actually the story just like breaks my heart every single time because, you know, as child loss parents, we sit with a lot of guilt. And so sometimes I think that there's a lot of things that I could have done differently. But um long story short, her father and I were together for 7 years, and I had found out that some things were going on that I didn't really care for. So I knew I was going to raise my daughter by myself. And so I had asked him to leave my home, and I went through my pregnancy, most of it, about 6 months of it by myself with my friends and my family, and it was wonderful. And in that time period, I bonded with my daughter so much because she became my world, right? She became everything to me in that time period. And so when she was born, she was a healthy baby, no problems, no issues, nothing out of the ordinary. She was absolutely wonderful. And I worked part time at the time. And so at the hospital I worked at as a speech pathologist, I was not able to take a full maternity leave. I was only able to take half of the time. So instead of 12 weeks, I got 6 weeks of maternity leave. And as you can imagine, as new mothers, we don't want to go back even after 12 weeks, let alone
No.
go back after 6 weeks. Yeah.
Mm.
So, what had happened is my aunt, she has several children ranging from the ages at the time of 9 to even 30 years old. So, my aunt has 6 children. And I had said to her, would you be able to watch Aviana for me the days that I work? Because I really only worked 2 10-hour days. So, I didn't think it was that much of an issue. And my aunt was like, of course, absolutely, no problem. And my aunt lives about an hour from my own home at that moment in time. And so she was caring for her. Every week I would drive her up. I'd take her up there for the 2 days and then I'd drive back. And then I'd go get her. And so one week I ended up contracting bronchitis. And I was really, really ill. I had already taken my daughter to my aunt's and she was with her for 2 days. I was supposed to go pick her up that day. And went to urgent care, and the doctor had said, um, if you have a newborn baby at home, I would really highly recommend that you be on antibiotics for 24 hours before you pick her up. So I toyed with it in my head and I thought, well, they're the medical professionals. They know what they're talking about. I probably should do this. So I called my aunt and I said, "Would you be able to keep her for another night? And I'll pick her up tomorrow." And she said, "Sure, absolutely." So in the interim, my mother had called me, who lives in North Carolina at the time, and she was giving me a really hard time. She was like, "What do you mean you're not going to get your daughter?" And I said, "Well, the doctor said it wasn't safe and I should not go get my daughter." And this was pre-COVID times. And my mom's like, "Well, why don't you just wear a mask?" And I was like, "So, if somebody said that to you now, you'd be more likely to say, 'Oh, that makes complete sense, you know?'"
Yeah, right.
But
Right.
even working in healthcare at the time, I'm like, "Mom, this is silly. Like, I'm just going to do what they say and I'm going to let Aunt April have her." And about 2 hours later, I was sitting on my couch and I was relaxing. And my mother called me and she said, "You need to get to the hospital." And I'm just like, "What hospital? What's going on? Where?" Like, that's a very vague statement. And she's like, "Avianna is on her way to the hospital." And at first, I thought, "Oh, well, maybe somebody was playing with her. Maybe she rolled off of something. Maybe they dropped her, God forbid, something." I thought it was just my cousins were playing with her or something like that. But I never prepared for the next line. And I said, "Well, Mom, what's going on?" And she said, "Well, she stopped breathing." And the minute you just know as a mom, you just know. And so the minute I heard she stopped breathing, Becky, I just started screaming. I just started screaming, like, no words, just screams, because I just had this aching feeling in my heart that I already knew. And so I thought, babies don't come back from that, right? And so I tried calling my aunt, I didn't get an answer. I tried calling my mom, I didn't get an answer, and nobody was telling me anything, which then exacerbated the feelings that I had, because why wasn't anyone talking to me? Like, my daughter's not breathing and she's on her way to the hospital. Why is no one talking to me? So about 10 minutes later, so I got in the car, I called her father and I said, "I'm going to the hospital." And he said, "Well, what are we going to do if she's not breathing?" And I just was like, "What? What?" And he was like, "Well, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going. And I don't know what you're doing, but I'm going. So that's your choice." So everybody around me was almost trying to, like, diffuse the situation and not take into account that this was a very serious situation for me. So about 10 minutes into my drive, uh, my friend actually was driving me because they didn't want me to drive alone.
Right. Yeah.
And my mom called and she said, "Honey, she didn't make it." And I will never forget those words. I'm sorry.
Mm.
Um, and the rest is kind of a blur that night, because
Mm.
when you hear that and you know what you're driving to, as you also know, um, I tried to distract myself. So things that you wouldn't even think of doing at the time, like, immediately I was like, "I have to call work." Right? Like, I have to call
Yeah.
work. I have to tell them I'm not coming tomorrow. And my friend was with me and they're like, "What do you mean you have to call work?"
You needed to do
And
something.
yes, I
Mhm.
needed to do something. So I started filling the hour drive with things that I needed to do, because I didn't want to call somebody and tell them. I didn't want to talk to
Mhm.
anybody about what was
Mhm.
going on.
Mhm.
I needed to fill the time with the way I needed to fill that time, right? And so that's what I started doing. I started doing things that would normally be illogical, probably, and irrational to most people. But it served its purpose. And that drive was probably a lot calmer than it could have been, because I did that, because I distracted myself. And so I got to the hospital and I remember saying, "How am I going to walk in? Like, how
Mm.
how am I going to walk in here, because I know she's not alive anymore? Like, how do I walk into that situation?" And my other family members were already there. My aunt was there. My younger brother was there. And so I said, I don't think I can do this. And my friend said to me, I think you have to. And it was that moment I was like, I owe her this and I'm going to go be with my daughter. And so I went to the hospital and I received her and she had the intubation tube still placed because the doctors said that they couldn't remove it because obviously they had to make sure that they did everything that they could from a medical standpoint. And the one thing I do recall is I sat with her for a really long time, but the social worker says, "Oh, you have as much time as you need with her," which, as you
A
know,
lie?
is a huge lie. So of course you hear that as a mother and you think, okay, like I'll have time to process, I'll have time to talk to my family, I'll have time to do all the things I need to do. And you mentally prepare for that. You mentally prepare to take care of that in your own mind, in your own ways. And then, you get whatever time they want to allow you. And then they're like, oh, it's time to go. And so that's what I remember from that night. I remember my father being there with me. I remember my brother being there with me. And I just remember being with Aviana. Um,
Yeah.
but kind of a blur still to this day. And that's about all I remember. And sometimes I feel guilty about that. And then I have to remind myself that, you know, I, I think a lot of us can't recall the exact details, whether it's because we don't want to, whether it's because like I pushed it away and kind of tried to,
Trauma response, maybe?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so now I've just helped myself feel as though that's okay. And now I believe that, right? I've
Mm,
processed all that. I've helped other people process a lot of emotions. And now I realize that that's just normal. There's nothing
mhm.
abnormal about that, and that's okay. So
Yeah.
that is my wonderful daughter's story. Healthy baby, no problems. And they did an autopsy, could not figure out
Yeah.
what had happened to her. The one thing they said is they think at that point in time that she couldn't regulate her body temperature. She, had 103-degree fever, but they couldn't find an etiology for it. So
Mm.
they pretty much ruled it a SIDS death.
Ugh, I'm so sorry. To not have any reasoning behind it, any, like, clarity or anything, like,
Mhm.
what is that like to, like, sit with? Do you sit and think about that ever, or do you turn it into something else, or, like,
That's a great
how do
question.
you handle that?
So at the beginning, I did. I sat with it all of the time. I ruminated on it consistently to the point that I would say, like, what if this and what if that and why? And my dad would always say to me, you can't drive yourself up a wall by asking yourself why, right? And I'm like, Dad, that's so easy for you to say, though. Like, there's no explanation for my daughter's death. And as somebody who lost their child or who we lose anybody, we want a reason because we think that that's going to help. We think that that reason is going to solidify something for us, whether we think it's going to help us process our grief better, whether we just think the answer is just going to make us feel better. There are several different, ideas behind that, but we do it all the time. And so what I had to do, Becky, is exactly what I got into here and why I, after years, decided to get into this space is I h- I used the strategies I used my patients who would ruminate on their loss of function in life. And what I would tell them, I'm like, I wonder if this would work for me. And so I started using some of those strategies with child loss. And lo and behold, it did help pull me out of that. But that's a very typical and normal response to ruminate. And you're right, I absolutely ruminated all of the time. I had to start shifting my perspective and start, utilizing some really guided self talk. to be able to pull myself out of that.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so you were a licensed speech pathologist before
Right.
stepping into grief mentorship. How did that transition happen, and how has your background influenced your approach to grief?
It happened because I would, like I said, I thought, well, I use all these strategies for patients that I have. I work with swallowing patients, patients who lose their ability to swallow, patients who lose their ability to speak. I have some patients who, after a stroke, can't remember their wife's name or can't get that out. So you imagine the loss of independence that presents, right? And so I help in within my scope of practice. I'm not a licensed social worker, and I'm not a licensed psychologist, but we are able to treat grief as it pertains to communication and swallowing disorders. And so I do a lot of inner work, remapping, neural remapping, and things with patients to help them to be able to overcome some of those situations. And so I started using some of the strategies I do with them, one of which I mentioned was, inner self talk. And when I started doing that, I recognized how much, I don't want to say faster, right? But I really am a firm believer. Everyone says, grief is your own process. Time doesn't heal all wounds. And I say that all the time.
Mm,
But I do think one thing we miss, whether we're going through the loss of function or whether we're going through the loss of our child, is you are able to process some things faster if you understand grief as a whole and the things you have available to you. And I think society has led us to believe, oh, they just give this blanket statement of, well, time has to heal it, and or, I grieve at my own pace. And I totally agree with that. I do. But if people have tools that they don't realize they have access to. That's the key. So if you have those tools and it's still taking you a certain length of time, I absolutely understand that. But if we don't even have those tools available to us or that knowledge available to us, then we're not able to, maybe process grief in the same way we could to kind of move ourselves forward a little faster, to feel like ourselves a little faster, to thrive a little faster. So it was an experiment essentially. And that's what I did. And I thought, am I going to listen to everyone in society tell me that this isn't possible? Or am I going to try this and see what happens?
mm,
And so I did. And that's where it came out of. And then what happened to make me start bringing it, to social media and you guys here is I would make my little headbands from the boutique that you had mentioned, and I would go to craft fairs. And while I was at craft fairs, people would talk to me about, oh, I know somebody who knows somebody who lost a child, or my daughter lost a child, or my cousin lost a child. And when I would get deep into conversations with them, there was a reoccurring theme that nobody really understood exactly what I didn't understand at the beginning. And I thought, well, if I could help myself and educate myself, I probably could educate other people and let them know, like, there is a different way. Like, we don't have
mm,
to stay stuck. We don't have to have others lead us to believe that there's not, a different process that we can utilize here.
mm.
And so that's when I decided, you know what, I'm going to be brave and I'm just going to go all in and I'm going to start putting this out on social media and see what happens. So that's how that all came about.
Beautiful. So talking about these tools that you teach and that you use, what are some of those? Like, what are like the biggest ones that seem to help?
Um, yeah, so I'm really big because of my role as a speech path and all the neuroscience courses and things that I had to take. I'm really big into a lot of research in neuroscience or listening to psychologists that kind of like favor the neuroscience side of things. And so the easiest way to talk about them is to reference a neuroscientist or psychologist. He's really awesome, and I love that he recently became bigger out on the scene because I never had a way to explain it to everybody. And he does research now that explains it. So then I don't have to try to like fumble with all my words and say, this is what it is, because then now there's terms for it, right?
Yeah.
It's lovely. I actually wish that he read his own email because I probably would send him a very huge thank you because I've been doing it with my patients for years and I had no idea how to talk about it with others. So one thing that was really big for me is, like I said, some self-talk, and talking to myself in the third person. And so a lot of times, think about it, we are much more capable of helping our friends and our family through a lot of problems than we are ourselves, right?
Selves.
And so one of the tools that I utilize on the regular is I talk to myself as if I'm an outsider. And I'm like,
Mm,
if something seems irrational, and I know I'm being irrational, a lot of us know that. We know like that's not logical, but we still feel it and we're still allowed to feel it.
mhm,
So after I'm allowed to feel it and I process that, I'm like, okay, Angela, we got to get our shit together. Pardon my language, but we need to get ourselves together here.
yeah,
So I will talk to myself like, all right, Angela, this is not the ideal situation. This isn't what we would want to happen, but this is what we're dealt with. So now we're going to make a go at it. And so I'll talk to myself that way. And I do it as if I was talking to my dad or my mom or a best friend.
mhm,
And you're able to come up with so many more solutions or possible solutions to a situation, to how you're feeling. You're really able to shift your feelings a lot easier if you're doing something like that.
mm,
So that's like yeah, that's just like a go-to that I have. I think it's very beneficial and I think it helps a lot of people. Um, but the neuroscientist psychologist I was talking about, his name is Ethan Cross, and I would highly recommend checking out his books. There's a book
mhm,
called Chatter, there's a book called Shift, and he talks about this stuff. He talks about the easy ways to shift your emotions. Um, and it's what I've been doing for a decade now.
mm,
And so he talks about there's things that require a lot of effort, right? And then there's things that require minimal effort. So another thing I like to do, which really helped me and I help my clients with, is journaling. And I know it's not
mm,
for everybody, but you can do journaling in so many different ways. And so when I first started, I didn't do guided journaling, but I also didn't just like let my mind wander and do that. I actually wrote to my daughter. And so I will find different ways with my clients to say, okay, if you're not a writer, let's try this. If that doesn't work, let's try this. So there are three different ways right there. You can randomly journal, right? You can guided journal, or then you can pick somebody to write to in journal. And those are three different ways that you can process emotions, all of which bring different things to the table when you do that. So that's another one I do on the regular, but journaling is very time intensive. So
mm,
it's not for everyone. And we don't always have the time for it. I also do small shifts throughout my day. So I might have a playlist that I have devoted to good vibes, right? Some of these things are such common sense, but when we're really deep in
so
grief, and
simple.
yeah. But when we're really deep in grief, we are engulfed in that grief. We can't even think about what we want to eat for dinner, let alone make dinner.
Mhm.
So when somebody's saying, hey, why don't you try making a list of 10 songs that put you in a really good mood? And when you have a really bad day or you're having a really bad time, stick one of those on and see what happens. And you're like, wow, like, why didn't I think of that? Like, it is so simple, but so there are environmental shifters. There are things that take minimal amount of time, minimal amount of thought that you can have at your disposal at any time. And then there's
Mm.
also those lengthier ones like journaling or self-talk. So those are just three like right out the gate that are very, very, very helpful.
I love those, and that's how I found you. It was one of your reels on Instagram of you, like, you were doing a voiceover of a letter to Avianna, and,
Mhm.
um, I loved it, and you then I started, like, digging into more of your reels, and, like, you go hardcore into some of the negative stuff that people say.
I
And
do.
I do this too, but, like, I love to listen to you preach, sister. It is so good, and you call these people out, and, um
I've
so
taken a lot of crap for it, but I wouldn't
yeah,
have it any
oh my
other
gosh.
way.
Yeah, and so, like, we both know that when you're open about your grief, you invite opinions unsolicited, ignorant, and sometimes downright cruel ones. Like, what's the worst thing someone has ever said to you about Aviana?
Oh, yeah. I would say several times in different verbiage and semantics, people have said, "She's better off without you. I'm glad she died." Yeah, yeah, like that. Or my favorite on a more clever, subtle, semantic play was, well, now we have another parking spot in the world or something like that. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. But it's when they said, "I'm so glad she's away from you. She's better off dead." Like people have
Oh my
literally
gosh.
written that on my page. And it's comical almost, not obviously comical from an emotional standpoint, but it's
Mm,
comical because it just shows how a, ignorant people are, but B, like how much this is needed. And so it makes me chuckle inside because they try to tear me down or tear us down because I know you're very vocal as well. But what they don't realize is I'm laughing inside because it's just fueling my fire even more.
mm,
I'm like, okay, you're just proving my point of why I need to be here and I need to do this and I need to stand up for this community.
yeah.
So,
Yep.
yeah. What is the worst thing that you have ever heard?
Oh, so I feel sorry for your other kids. And I've heard that one over and over and over again.
Really?
Yes, and I've actually, heard it from somebody that, I was once friends with, not just a troll on the internet, and, like, I feel sorry for, daughter number 2
Oh
with
my
the
lord.
way you talk about daughter number 1 who is dead and, like, she's going to grow up in this, you know, in the backsplash and whatever. Just stupid stuff about my other kids and the way I display Gracie all over, my house and how I just am so open and vocal about her, and it's just, yeah, you need to get therapy. You need therapy. You need
Oh yeah,
therapy.
that's a
Over
favorite too.
and
I'm
over.
like, yeah, that one makes me laugh so much because I'm a therapist myself and I'm
Yeah,
like,
right.
"Oh, okay, yeah, I need therapy now." It makes me chuckle.
Mhm.
Because people just can't fathom, like, actually talking about it because they don't recognize unless they went through it that that's actually very therapeutic for so many people.
Mhm. So for years I was, pretty quiet about, Gracie passing and stuff. I kinda kept to myself and stayed in my house, and I didn't go anywhere, see anybody. I said no to every event everywhere. But once I, like, discovered that I could go on a platform and just talk about her because I wanted to, because
Mhm.
it wasn't welcome anywhere else, I started doing it. And slowly over time, like, I've felt more joyful because I've given myself that space. Nobody else
Mhm.
did.
Right. Yeah.
And I gave myself that permission to talk about her just as much as I talk about my other kids. And it's just brought so much healing, and that's my biggest tool
Yeah,
is to
no.
talk about her.
I think you make a great point in terms of I love how you said, like, giving permission. Because I think that's why I started this entire thing, because not only do I wanna give people permission to talk about their child, but like I said, there are so many outdated thoughts about grief, so many outdated societal, norms that aren't true, that aren't helpful, and so if you've noticed, which I know you have, like, my short form video, not only do I call people out, but I also make people recognize that you have permission to do whatever the heck you need
Mm,
through this process, right?
yeah.
And so I'm really glad you said that because that is what I'm all about. I'm all about giving yourself permission. And when people start to recognize that they have permission to speak up, they have permission to feel however they want, they have permission to not listen to the six people telling them, well, you need to do this instead of this. So
So
I'm
if
really glad you said that.
Hey, friend. Grief is heavy, especially when it's the loss of a child. It's messy, unpredictable, and let's be honest, sometimes it just sucks. That's exactly why I created the Grief Relief Journal for Child Loss, a free resource to help you put words to the ache, process the impossible, and find even the smallest moments of relief. This journal isn't about fixing your grief because, let's be real, that's not how this works. It's about giving you a space to be exactly where you are, raw, real, and unfiltered. And the best part? It's completely free. Just grab the link in the show notes and download it today because your grief deserves to be heard, not hushed. So if someone like listening has received a hurtful comment from family or friends or strangers, how would you suggest they respond? That's it. I still have a tough time with that one.
Yeah, no, that's great. So one thing that I work on with my clients, whether it's a speech pathology client, because with those clients, they go out into the community not being able to speak. And as you can imagine, people either think they're drunk, they think they're, intellectually disability, like they think all of these things about patients. And so the one thing that's really helpful is I tell people to in the beginning so that it's a process, right? So you can't just all of a sudden come out the gate. If I sat here and said, okay, these are some of the strategies you can use, you're not going to be able to use them tomorrow. So that's number
Mhm.
one. Like grief takes practice. How we grieve and
Yeah.
what we choose to utilize takes practice. So, what I start with, as I start by saying, we're going to take a situation in your regular life. So, this is what I would tell people take a situation in your regular life that you have a hard time navigating, right? Maybe it's something with your husband, maybe it's something with one of your children, and there's always a fight, or maybe you get defensive a lot of times, or they get defensive. So, I tell people, script an if then statement for when that happens. Like, okay, so if my son gets upset here, then I'm going to respond this way. So that when that happens, you have a scripted response in your brain for that. Practice that in a non grief oriented situation. And then after you've practiced that with those type of situations, you can start to create those same scripts in those same if then situations with your grief. If somebody says something insensitive to you, if somebody tells you, oh, it's been 2 years, I don't know why you're still upset about this, all of those types of things. So that's what I would tell people. I would say, first, recognize that it's practice. It's not going to happen overnight and give yourself some slack. Then I would say, start with something not oriented with your grief or a major insensitive comment with grief. Do it with your husband, your son, your daughter, and try to script something that makes sense to you. And then identify it when it happens, utilize your script, and then you can start doing that with your grief. Does that make sense?
Mm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Practice, 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 just
Yeah.
like we do with everything else in life.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I don't think people realize that they can practice this kind of stuff.
Mm.
They just think
Mhm.
it's always gonna be, and that's why I say time doesn't heal all wounds, but what time does is it gives you the ability to then use these strategies with trial and error. It's what you
Mm.
do with time, Becky. It's not
Yeah.
time itself.
Yeah.
So, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's like anything else. You're not gonna get better at it if you don't do it or if you don't try to navigate it. As
Mm.
evidenced by yourself, as evidenced
Yeah.
by myself, like, I can guarantee that this space has helped you process your grief, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Saying things out loud loud and proud have really helped me. Like, even in some of, like, the skits that
I
I do on
love
my
your
reels. Oh, I have more coming, and they're really funny.
skit.
Um, but sometimes I do this back and forth of, like, this is what people have actually said to me, and then I will film myself, like, responding to that, how I would in my head, but also how I would out loud to them. And that I guess I'm kind of doing that, practicing
You are.
the script
You
a little bit
absolutely are,
already.
yeah, you absolutely are. Yeah, I think you do a very good job. I love watching your skits, and I wish I always watch your stuff, and, it's so funny because 'cause you're like, "Oh, I love when you do your stuff and you really put it out there," and I love yours, and I'm always like, "Man, I wish I could be that creative," but I'm not that creative in the social media realm of things. I am with my own patients, but not with myself. So, yeah, I would do more of that, but do it on a personal level, right? So you
Yeah.
do it in your content, but then take some time, maybe like even if it's like once a week. And one thing that's really helpful is to have scripts that are already written out. It can be like, we all dread the question, how many children do you have, right?
Mhm.
I know so many people dread that question. So have a couple different scripted responses for that, and then they're at your disposal. And just remember, you can use the same thing over and over and over again. You don't have to change it
Right.
because you're going to come into contact with many people. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. Mhm.
So,
So you talk about making grief functional. What does that look like in everyday life?
great question. So, to me, functional looks like walking beside your grief, right? Like walking with it, not just dismissing it. Because a lot of us feel, I know I stayed stuck for so long because I thought I should make some content about this, but I thought
Yes. Write it
that,
down.
write it down. I thought if I felt better tomorrow, if I felt better in 3 weeks, if I felt better in 6 months, what does that mean about the love for my child? Does that mean I'm forgetting Avianna, right? And we have this guilt in us about either other people perceiving it as we're forgetting our child or ourselves perceiving it that way, or us actually thinking and believing that that is what's happening. And so for me, it's a way to still honor your child, still bring up your child, still talk about your child, still celebrate your child, but also thrive at the same time, right? Like to still live your life, to still have joy. You mentioned joy before, joyous moments, to still laugh, to still have fun, to incorporate your child if you're able to in the things you're doing now. That is like the definition of functional for me in terms of child loss. Like, can you still incorporate your child or your child's memory, still have a good time, and thrive in that situation? And so that is what I help my clients to be able to do. And again, whether it's in the loss of a child or their independence, you still want to be able to walk alongside both of those things. And so
Mm.
that's what I mean by functionality.
I love that. Oh, I wanted to talk about these grief retreats that you do. I
Oh.
I have always I have this secret dream of putting together like a mom's loss retreat type thing.
Mhm.
So I want to know like what happens at these retreats and why are they so powerful for lost
So,
parents?
disclaimer, I have done several in the speech therapy realm of things, retreats, but I've only done one child loss retreat. And this is actually what got me into this space. When I said I started talking about people, or started talking, excuse me, to people at my craft shows, it was really my biggest dream ever was to do the retreats, even over, one-on-one client experiences or little group programs. And so I've only done one, but it involves pretty much like 2 days of other lost parents getting together, sharing in the stories of your children, doing some mindful activities. I'm not talking like woo woo or foo foo stuff. I'm talking about functional things, right? Like,
Mhm.
we get together, there might still be things offered like yoga or an art therapy kind of session, just group therapy. You can choose to partake, you don't have to. Stuff within nature. So we plan this. Nutrition. So nutrition is a big thing when we're on a grieving journey. We don't fuel our
Mhm.
bodies properly. So
Trust me.
having a nutritionist talk to us about like, hey, you know what? I know this is really hard, but here are some ideas that can be quick fixes when grief hits or you don't have the capacity to be able to cook dinners and things like that. So just things that, fuel our overall wellness, anything that has to do with doing that, moving our body. Maybe it's partaking in a 15-20 minute exercise, that you could then take and make your own when you go home. You can
Mhm.
tailor it to your individual needs. You can get some ideas at the retreat and then be like, oh, I actually could probably make this work. So just moving our body, talking, having conversations, doing some art, taking up new interests and things like that, having introductions of some of the things that worked for some parents that might work for other parents. Even on the flip side, saying, you know what, I've tried these things, did not work, do not recommend. Can
Yeah.
somebody recommend something else? And just having that free space to openly talk about what works for you. Group meals, whether it's breakfast, lunches, dinners, things like that, and just having, a time with other parents who really understand, can validate your feelings. That
Mhm.
is the biggest thing of nothing else. Like you're surrounded by people that you're like, this just feels at home because these people can validate me and they make me feel like I'm not a crazy person. I'm not this
Yeah.
person that the world doesn't understand.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're for. But yeah, that was what I originally went into this space for. So
And are you doing another one? When are you doing another one?
I am. I will be doing one. The date is not exact yet, but it's either August or September. I do not know. And my goal eventually, after doing enough of these and kind of just growing this entire program, is to go across the country because there are so many places
Mhm.
that have, the need
Retreat.
and they
Yeah.
don't have services
Yeah.
available to them. They don't even
Yeah.
have support groups available to them. So, or in person support groups. And so I want to provide that for people. So I'm going to try to make the location different every time as I get them up and running.
I like that. That's really good.
I can't wait.
So,
It's so fun.
I have this, big hairy question.
Okay.
If you could rewrite the societal rules around grief, what would
Oh,
they be?
if I could rewrite societal's rules around grief. Well, first of all, I would shout from the rooftops that there is no right or wrong way to grieve, right? Like, I would make it a point that people's judgment is not helpful and that everybody is individualized. Everything in life, everything is individualized no matter what we're doing. Like what works for me does not work for you, does not work for John down the road or Susie up the road. Like it's just not.
Mhm.
So, I would say, everything's individualized. Society needs to understand that. We need to rewrite that rule. Number two, judgment is not helpful. And also, if just because I'm upset about something, just because people grieving are upset about something, doesn't mean that they're also not grateful, doesn't mean that they're also not
Yeah.
happy, right? They can
Yes.
coexist. So, this societal norm of, oh, well, if she's pissed off and telling me that this isn't a helpful way to deal with grief, that means she's angry, she's frustrated, she's projecting on me.
Mm.
No, it means I'm trying to authentically tell you that this is not helpful, but I'm
Yes.
still okay. Like, I'm still happy. I'm still thriving. But that doesn't mean I can't tell you what we need instead. And so I would say lack of judgment and then just understanding people can coexist with their feelings. It's not, happy or sad. It's not frustrated or like absolutely wonderful rainbows and sunshine. That's not how this works. We can do it all at the same time. And so I think that. And then the last thing is society needs the rule rewritten that we can practice this stuff. And if we start practicing, Becky, in smaller situations outside of grief as our children are growing up, as we're engulfed in some situations outside of grief in general, like, you know, human communication, if we teach this kind of stuff in our courses in school as opposed to we learn history, we learn
Yeah.
geography, we learn math.
Yeah.
We don't learn how to grieve, and if we are presented with options before something traumatic and large and astronomical happens to us, we are much more equipped to deal with that.
Mm.
And so I would rewrite that like every day over and over again.
They should have a class, in high school about emotions and, like, grief and the things that will happen to you just as much as, like, you need to learn how to write a check and do your
Absolutely.
taxes,
Because,
and we didn't
nobody
have those classes.
no, and now we don't even need check writing because nobody does that anymore.
No, right, but
But we could have used the emotional support the whole time.
yeah. Yes,
So
absolutely.
yes,
Oh,
that
I
was a
love it.
really good question. I loved that question.
I did too, I thought about it, I'm like, I'm
It
gonna
was great.
ask
I loved it.
everybody that. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about what you're doing and your work?
Yeah, sure. I'm predominantly on Instagram. I created my page. It's strength underscore for underscore recovery. And not recovery in the sense of making everything better. That's not
Mhm.
it. It's, recovery for thriving and living alongside your grief. But also, I have my little boutique. So Fly AV Fly also. That I've only predominantly done for friends and family, but I am ramping that up because I've had so many people asking me for some of the headbands and personalized items. So, because the demand is there, I'm going to actually incorporate that as well. Plus, the proceeds benefit scholarships for retreats. So, if there's a parent who wants to come to a future retreat and they can't afford it or they're tight on money, I do not want that to limit them. So, Fly AV Fly is going to allow them to do that. So, either of my two Instagrams is where I'm most active.
Awesome. I love it. I'm so excited that you could come on here. And I feel like we're so alike in how we approach talking about our kids and talking about our grief. And I'm so glad we could connect on here. And
I'm so glad you
yeah.
had me. I was very honored that you had asked me. I will not lie. I was like, "Oh," and I was even more honored because like you said, I think the way that we connect and the way our content is presented to people is a lot alike because we're very vocal about the grief space and we're very vocal about what is helpful for us and that we should allow other people to grieve whatever way they need. So when you asked me, I was like, "Ooh, I can, exacerbate that a little bit."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, good. I'm so glad, Angela. This was fun.
it was fun. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.